How do I determine what my obligations are in life?
First and foremost, if you want to be clear on what your obligations are, your first obligation is to develop your intellect. For the simple reason that it's the intellect which bypasses the bias and the influence of the mind to see the truth directly. Right? So when they're caught up in the mind, and I ask the question, what is my obligation to my sibling, parent, work colleague, etc., the tendency will be for the mind to exert its influence and to tell me what it would like to do. And then if my intellect's not clear, strong, I'll look at what my mind wants me to do and think, that's my obligation. So this is part of the bias that you're talking about. The only reason we find it difficult to figure out what to do in most scenarios is that the mind is exerting its influence and causing us confusion. If the mind wasn't exerting any of its influence, it's going to be much easier for us to figure out what our obligations are. So in order to bypass the mind's influence and strengthen the intellect, so there's your daily reflection and nightly introspection. That's a long-term solution to that problem of what is my obligation. When it comes to specific environments or specific relationships, one of the things that you can do is anything that depersonalizes it. For the same reason, the confusion comes in because we personalize it. Go back to the scenario of the Bhagavad-Gita. Now, Arjuna is a warrior in the middle of a righteous war on the side of good, when the bad guys have used all sorts of corrupt ways and means of usurping power, and they are also consequently sending the society down the drain. It could not be more crystal clear that his obligation is to fight this righteous war and install the rightful and righteous rulers back to their position. It's obvious. So why is it so difficult for Arjuna to see that? Who is a warrior, who's a general, who's engaged in so many battles? The reason it's so difficult for him to recognize that it's his obligation to fight is because he personalizes the situation. Same for us. Anytime the situation is personalized for us, what our obligation is will become difficult for us to figure out. So how do we depersonalize? So what we can do is, for a specific relationship or a specific situation, don't think of it so much as what is my obligation here. So let's say, for example, it's an obligation to a parent, and you're trying to figure out whether I should or should not. Generally speaking, if there is a parent and a son, what is the obligation for this particular relationship in a very general sense? Forget you. What is the obligation of a child to a parent? So you look at the obligations as they are in general, not applying to your specific relationship. You can create different ways of invoking that sense of dispassion or distance. One thing that can sometimes work is imagine that someone has come to you and asked you the very question that you're asking yourself. One of your best friends comes and asks you, this is the situation I'm in. Imagine what you would say to that person if you were giving them advice. So it's not perfect, because you still know, your intellect still knows, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on for me. But just creating that thought experiment can give you a little bit of distance between the scenario and your own thinking. As far as figuring out what your obligations are in any given moment, one thing to do is to list all of the options. What are all of the options available to me? And write them all down. I can do this, or this, or this, or this. And one interesting thing you can do is go to extremes. Parents want you to attend some family function. As you say, one thing is to just suppress your own thoughts and feelings and just do what they say. That's one extreme. The other is to outright reject and say, no, I'm not doing it, and screw the parents. In between of those two extremes is a whole range of middle grounds. So start with the extremes. What's the most extreme left I can go, action that I could perform? What's the most extreme right action that I could perform? And then think of the compromises in between that are available to you. And then you can evaluate the pros and the cons of each option. And you won't have 100 options. It'll literally be, for any particular scenario, situation, or relationship, it might be 3-4 different reasonable options. For each of those options, you weigh the pros and the cons. Pick them off one by one. so that when you've done that, you become very clear. So those are very general approaches. And as for the specifics, like I say, they'll be determined more by the specifics of the relationship or the situation.